Certainly the most enduring achievement of King Solomon's reign was the building of the temple in Jerusalem. It was to serve as God's permanent dwelling on earth, so no expense was spared in its construction. The finished product was marveled at throughout the world. For over 400 years, this magnificent representation of God's presence served as the focal point of Israelite religion. The destruction of the temple in 587 BC at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar was arguably the greatest tragedy experienced by the Israelites. Forced to leave their country of origin, the exiled community longed for the familiar setting of Israel, and the now destroyed temple came to symbolize their lost prosperity. Roughly 50 years after the temple's destruction, King Cyrus of Persia ended the Babylonian domination of the ancient Near East. Cyrus generously allowed exiled peoples to return to their countries of origin. Now the temple could be rebuilt. That is, if the money could be raised. Under the guidance of Professor David L. Peterson, we shall see that this is the setting of Haggai and the first 8 chapters of Zechariah.
Both the books of Haggai and Zechariah begin with verses that set their historical context. These verses are similar to those found at the beginning of other prophetic books, like those of Amos or Jeremiah. But there is one huge difference. Haggai and Zechariah begin with references to a foreign king, Darius, whereas many earlier prophetic books began with reference to a king of Israel or a king of Judah. This simple difference reflects a major change for those who worshipped Israel's God. From the period of roughly 1000 to 600 BC, those people had lived in a nation ruled by a member of the house of David. And although members of that house were still around, what had been a monarchy was now a rather small precinct in the Persian Empire. Still, that little place on the larger map of the ancient Near East was important. First, it was important to the Persians. The territory, which we may now call Judah, sat on the far western flank of the Persian Empire. In such a location, it possessed strategic importance. Persia wanted to control Egypt and influence Phoenician cities on the Mediterranean coast. Persian troops moved through this area, and so they needed food and supplies for their army. All this meant that in 520 BC, when both Haggai and Zechariah were active, Darius, the Persian king, wanted the local people in these regions to be as content and hospitable as possible. As a result, the Persians provided some of the resources for major building projects in the area, including funds for the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. Second, Judah was important to those who worshiped God. Those who worshiped Israel's God now lived in Egypt, Cyprus, Babylon, and elsewhere. Worship of the God of Israel, one might even now say early Judaism, had become a truly international religion. But it still had a theological, geographical focal point. Jerusalem. Though the temple lay in ruins, the idea of God's presence in Zion had been preserved in the Psalms and in other literature. God had been present to those in exile, as Ezekiel makes clear, but Jerusalem remained an especially holy place. Even before the temple was rebuilt, worship of various sorts was still going on in Jerusalem. Nonetheless, the regular round of sacrifices and other standard forms of worship, as described especially in Numbers and Leviticus, could take place only if the temple were rebuilt. So for both Persians and Israelites, rebuilding the temple was appropriate. But after some preliminary attempts, the building still had not been erected. This is where Haggai and Zechariah enter the scene. Both are active at roughly the same time. Both are concerned with helping to establish political and religious order in Jerusalem. But they offer quite different literary, political, and theological approaches. Let us look at Haggai and Zechariah in turn. The book of Haggai focuses directly on the importance of rebuilding the temple. But what that prophet says is much different from today's fundraising campaigns for new church construction or for building renovation. Haggai argues that temple construction is tied to the way the world works. On one hand, he says that agricultural disaster has struck because the temple remains in ruins. Drought, blight, mildew, and hail have brought Judah's agricultural activity to a standstill. On the other hand, he maintains that if the temple is rebuilt, wealth beyond measure will pour into this small area. This almost magical effectiveness of rebuilding the temple probably seems strange to us. And yet, Israel felt deeply that God was uniquely present to them in Jerusalem. Without an appropriate earthly symbol for the indwelling presence of God, things were in disorder throughout the universe. The book of Zechariah presents a far more complicated picture, primarily since it includes both vision reports and prophetic sayings. First, the visions present colorful pictures using vivid though bizarre imagery. We should not feel embarrassed if we do not understand these visions immediately, since the text makes very clear that Zechariah himself couldn't always make sense of them. In the very first vision report, we are told that the prophet sees some horses, to which he responded immediately, "What are these?" These difficult to understand visions provide the occasion for a message. In that first vision, we hear the message in Zechariah 1:11. The whole earth remains at peace. On the surface, that sounds pretty good. But the angel of the Lord reacts as if it were bad news. The angel utters words of lament, "O Lord of hosts, how long will you withhold mercy from Jerusalem?" This angel knows that the peace and stability of the world during the early Persian period is bad news for Jerusalem. Jerusalem remains an unrestored city. There is no new order to replace the old one. So an image of the world at peace means bad news for Jerusalem. The visions go on to show that God is about to act on behalf of this city. At the end of the last vision, which was presented in Zechariah 6, we see horses again, but this time they move around. There is lots of activity. In the intervening visions, we have heard about various ways in which Jerusalem and the political and religious order housed there are being restored. The prophetic sayings in Zechariah 1-8 sound much more like Haggai. In fact, Zechariah 6:9-15 could be called the first fundraising campaign. The prophet seeks silver and gold from those who are returning to Jerusalem from exile in Babylon. But even here, Zechariah is different from Haggai. Haggai was telling the people to build the temple, whereas Zechariah emphasizes the importance of what God is doing to help Israel. The book of Ezra narrates some of these same events. Ezra 3 reports that early in the building of the second temple, many of the people who had seen the first house on its foundations wept with a loud voice when they saw this house, though many shouted aloud for joy. Clearly, some were overjoyed that the temple was being rebuilt. Others knew that this second temple was far less majestic than Solomon's temple. We can imagine that both Zechariah and Haggai would have been among those who shouted for joy, and yet they would have come to that joy along quite different routes. Whether along the route taken by Haggai or by Zechariah, people helped rebuild the temple and the religious community associated with it. This temple and the city in which it was located was the place in which early Judaism began to emerge during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. Moreover, the third or Herodian temple where Jesus taught depended upon the continuity in worship and teaching represented by this second temple. So Jews and Christians today depend upon the preaching and fundraising activities of these two often forgotten prophets, Haggai and Zechariah.